The city learned to pretend nothing was missing. It did this expertly, by smoothing sidewalks where gaps had been, by extending handrails past stairwells that no longer led anywhere, by revising building permits with clean lines that skipped rooms a resident swore once existed. Even the light conspired, edging around absences the way a river skirts a stone it refuses to acknowledge. In the morning, buses opened their doors and took on no one at stops that had lost the person who always boarded there. At night, windows darkened according to schedules nobody remembered setting. Systems admire continuity. They will counterfeit it if they must. Blake Walker made maps of the counterfeits.
It was a job with a title that made people smile sadly: Continuity Cartographer, 3rd Division. He worked in a brittle building of frosted glass where the elevators never announced floors, as if naming destinations made them less reliable. His instruments were cameras that refused to see, compasses that spun obediently until someone asked what north meant, and a book he carried because paper forgives in ways databases do not. On the cover, he had written nulls with a pen that would outlast him. There were rules for dealing with the sphere. They were not published. They were whispered by people who had learned that ink disappears first. The first rule was simple and, like all simple rules, cruel. Do not name what you cannot afford to lose.
The second had the dignity of modesty. Stand at the edge and wait. The third was a priest's rule disguised as a scientist's. Notice without wanting. A person who wanted too hard brought the sphere closer. A person who hated it taught it their shape. The city had grown around a dozen small hollows by the time Blake joined 3rd Division. Hollows were where ground gave up on pretending and opened a painless, perfectly circular absence. Objects fallen into a hollow did not hit bottom. They became before. People who fell did not die. They simply failed to have been. Houses adjusted themselves. Payrolls and family trees closed ranks. Photographs obeyed new geometries. The colors of certain rooms shifted a degree cooler, as if relieved of a shade of memory. The world hates a contradiction. The sphere removed them. His first week, the office assigned him to revisit a staircase that residents argued had never existed and had been dangerous for years. The staircase rose between two buildings that once touched. It carried nobody, nowhere, in 12 elegant steps. He stood at the base with his book and a pencil and wrote, "Stair, stone, north-facing, no shadow at noon, handrail new, purpose none." The pencil made the notes an act of insistence. Pencils are loyal to human error. They will smudge before they surrender. By habit, he looked behind him to see who'd follow later and make his notes look childish. No one did. 3rd Division rarely moved in pairs anymore. The less they looked like a choir, the longer their measures held. At night, when the city surrendered to the mercy of anonymity, Blake dreamed in erasures. In one, he sat at a table with 2 cups of coffee and watched steam rise from only one. The other cup disappeared by becoming a coaster. The coaster disappeared by becoming a knot in the wood. He would wake then and look at the text on his phone, expecting to find someone's name the way a hand expects a railing on stairs. He found numbers, hard and kind and true, numbers that never learn your face. He filled pages with the small diagnoses an honest map provides. On 1, park bench, slat count revised, 7 to 6. Varnish color shifts under rain. manufacturer's plate missing, bolts still 10. On another, curb remembers wheelchairs. There were no heroics in this work, only a discipline that tasted like ash, but strengthened the jaw. You could keep a city's soul alive with such medicine if the city wanted to live. The first time Blake saw the sphere itself, he mistook it for weather. It appeared where a market had been, making a circle that took a square from the world neatly as a lens cut from glass. The air above it buckled inward like heat over a road, then froze, then shook slightly as if embarrassed by the attention it had just asked for. The ground at the circle's edge sloped inward by degrees too patient for gravity to resent. When a paper cup inched across the cobbles and fell in, it did not drop. It unhappened. Around him, people did what people do in the early seconds of the end of a thing. Some laughed and filmed, as if ridicule were a harness. Some cried, in the way weather cries, sound without weeping. One man stood on a crate with a sermon in his bones and found his voice as useful as a bell rung underwater. A mother counted to 3, then to 10, and realized she had one number too many and no idea which it was. Third Division arrived not with sirens, but with cordons, ropes strung between poles sunk into holes that had no reason to grip them. The ropes were not to keep people out. Ropes cannot keep anyone out who wishes to leave themselves behind. They were to give the morning something to do later when it came to dress the scene in the language of bureaucracy. Cordon, Incident 14. Resolved would be written when there was nothing left to resolve. Blake stood at the rope and did what the second rule asked. He waited. Waiting is underestimated as an act of compassion. It gives a thing a chance to tell you what it is without the pressure of your expectations. The sphere, shy at first, learned the cadence of being looked at with nothing to prove. The inward buckle at its center formed a suggestion of a throat. Around the lip, the ground performed a grace that made math indulge poetry. Each cobble slumped inward by a fraction of its own thickness, as if it wished to become less. The circle, neat as a dogma, stayed perfectly round. The man on the crate stepped down, as men always do. A woman near Blake checked her phone for a child she had never had, and frowned at a message thread that still held her side of every conversation. A delivery drone arrived and hovered, uncertain. It dropped its parcel toward the edge, and then, ashamed of its clumsiness, rose. The parcel slid along cobbles toward the circle with the humility of a person approaching an altar they do not believe in. When it reached the lip, it became not delivered, not shipped, not manufactured, then not imagined, and finally not possible. The drone lifted, lightened by what it had failed to do. Back at the office, Third Division entered another line of text into a ledger that refused to be robust. The entry accepted their keystrokes and then revised itself to the shorter language of a world that never needed a word for a thing that never was. Market, rezoned, became lot, undeveloped. The maps refreshed with a blankness that looked honest, except to people who knew what honesty costs. The city went on, as cities do. Where the circle had been, someone painted lines, and someone else parked a car. Not because they were cruel, but because purpose needs a daily meal. Later, a boy would ride a bicycle through that space, and the tires would make a sound that reminded the ground of how the sphere had felt. For 1 second, the boy would think of someone he had not met and feel shy. Then he would grow up and keep that shyness for the right hour. Blake learned,
the slow way, that his job was not to fix anything. His job was to refuse to become a liar. He carried the book for that. Pencil pressure leaves a groove longer than memory keeps ink. He wrote not to accumulate facts, but to preserve a posture. A culture can be built around a posture. It looks like a dance. He noticed, 6 months in, that his handwriting leaned differently on Wednesdays. On those days, the rightward slant eased back toward plum, and the tails of his Y's rose as if they had remembered how to be grateful. Looking up at the office clock, he discovered Wednesday afternoon was when the administrative system archived personnel files. That was the hour people left, or stayed but forgot what leaving meant, or returned without having gone. The system threw a tarp over such motions and labeled the lumpy shape beneath it retention. The tarp, as tarps do, made everything under it seem larger and less interesting. On a Wednesday, a person Blake knew did not pass his desk. She wore a ring that flashed in a way that had taught his eyes a rhythm. He had no name to give the absence of that flash. He only knew the hallway smelled one note less like citrus. He went to the restroom and washed his hands the way you do when a body wants to be held and you cannot find a hand. Water obeyed gravity, and then the drain, and then the city. He returned to his desk and wrote nothing at all for a minute he could believe. The sphere did not need to be in the room for the room to be practicing. There was an angle in his apartment that kept not existing properly. It was the corner where the frame of the kitchen doorway met the bookcase he had built on a day he needed a structure to answer him back. He had measured the angle 5 times then, suspecting the walls of imprecision. He had drawn the corner on paper, the lines correct, the lengths plausible, and felt the pleasure of a square whose numbers believed in each other. Now, certain mornings, the angle changed, ever so slightly obtuse, then mildly acute, then true again, like a knee learning weather. He placed a coin at the base of the bookcase and wrote the date on it. On days the angle forgot itself, the coin was not there, and the dust was unbroken. On days it remembered, the coin glimmered with the confidence of old metal. He tried to tell a colleague about the coin and could not find the grammar. The colleague nodded in the way people nod for each other when bodies translate what mouths cannot. They each turned back to their screens with the relief of having been heard in the only language left. Reports accumulated on his desk like a careful snowfall. Null anomalies, micro hollows, artifact persistence failures. The new phrase that week was witness decay, the tendency of people who had watched a hollow open to become confused about their own birthdays. Dates would soften, then move, then politely erase themselves from forms, until the forms grew unembarrassed by blanks. Blake had 2 birthdays for an hour. It was Wednesday. He stood by a window and watched his reflection decide whether his hairline should be braver. He looked down at his hands to avoid deciding for it. On the ring finger of his right hand was a mark where a ring had never been. He pressed it with his thumb and felt the body's memory correct the record. Then the mark faded the way blush fades, and he had the curious shame of someone caught alone in a theater, hoping for applause from a play that hadn't started. He returned to the book and made a new page. Personal, unreliable. Under it, he wrote a date from childhood, and then watched his hand hesitate before finishing the year. He drew a square. The lines met at an angle that would need a coin. When the child arrived at an incident cordon, carrying 2 birthdays,
Blake stopped breathing for a moment that tasted of antiseptic and winters he had not earned. She stood within the rope as if born there, which perhaps she had been, which perhaps she hadn't. She wore a jacket painted with stars that stubbornly refused to form constellations. She told the official at the rope the truth without words. There was a mother she remembered, and there was a mother she did not, and both truths had shaped her mouth. Her hands rested in her pockets, a posture learned from someone the city would insist she had never met. The official looked at her with a fatigue that had forgotten it was once idealism. The rope sagged slightly. Blake knelt, because children understand knees are more honest than eyes. He did not ask her name. He asked nothing at all. He waited. She offered a coin, as if payment were required to stand where she stood. The coin was bent exactly where coins do not bend. On one side, the face had been rubbed out, the way a thumb rubs a photograph that stopped telling the truth. On the other, a number had become two numbers, depending on the light. He took the coin carefully. It was still warm. He imagined two pockets, two jackets, two mothers reminding a child not to lose the coin they had given for luck. He said nothing. Saying nothing was what the child required to remain possible for another minute. Later, when he had returned home with a laundry receipt in his wallet that belonged to a garment he did not own, Blake found the angle in his apartment had become a corridor. It should not have been a corridor. He lived in a geometry that resented ambition. But there it was. Where two lines met last week, there now stretched a length of space long enough to fit regret. He set the coin on the floor and watched it decide whether it would obey this new invitation or roll back to the room that had loved it. The coin remained loyal to him in a way that made him grateful and frightened. Inside the corridor, the world smelled like paper left under sunlight on a windowsill, the smell of plans that were once good ideas. He walked 3 steps, and the floor remembered the weight of someone heavier than he was. He walked 3 more, and the air learned to taste of ozone and apology. On the 7th step, he stopped, because stopping is the way you tell a place your body is still yours. The corridor did not widen the way a human would to show generosity. It lifted its ceiling instead, as if making room for a thought he had not had yet. At the end of the corridor was a door, not designed by anyone the city would admit to employing. The door had no knob. It had a small depression in the metal, the size and shape of a coin, the exact kind of shape machines carve when they need a person to feel essential. He did not place the coin there. To have done so would have been obedience, and obedience is the language of machines long after that language has ceased to be useful. He placed his palm against the door, where a mouth might be if doors needed mouths. The metal did not warm. The depression did not glow. The corridor kept its breath. When he stepped back, he found himself holding a piece of paper he had not taken from anywhere. It was thin enough to forgive never being folded, and thick enough to insist it had a purpose. On it, a sentence he had not written in his hand that nonetheless knew his slant. A machine that erases is not cruel if it erases what makes cruelty inevitable. Beneath it, but mercy without witness becomes tyranny. The page felt like a room speaking. Clio, he wrote under the sentence because his hand insisted on a name. The moment the letters dried, he could not recall why he had chosen those 5. He could not recall choosing at all. The Clio Institute lived in the city the way bones live under skin. dense, modest, and content to be forgotten by the eyes they allowed themselves to hold. It had been founded in 2129 by people who had survived something they would have preferred to never name. They had intended to make a room where bad men could be removed from history without glorifying the men or resembling them. The first experiment had gone the way first experiments do. It had accomplished the aim and made hunger out of victory. There were records of the Institute's work preserved in wrappers that described bottled water. Third Division did not catalog them. Third Division lent them the quiet that keeps some true things alive. Blake sat in a warehouse with a page from a conference program that had never occurred and read abstract prose about anonymized retroactive harm reduction. He kept a pencil between the pages the way a person keeps a finger in a book when someone asks them to stand. The pencil left a mark on the paper behind the page he read. He smiled. The world had not surrendered completely. The Institute had built a smaller sphere, no larger than a room, inside a building that no longer appears on the maps on purpose. They had called it an apocryphon, a text kept out of canon, not because it is false, but because it cannot be managed by the faithful without ruining their faces. They had placed inside it a body whose crimes made echoes hurt. The body became a knot. The sentence that would have described the justice accomplished became an adverb that described a wind. The room developed humility. The city exhaled the way cities exhale when a pressure on the jaw eases and chewing becomes possible again. What nobody among those intent people could account for was what the room learned from being thanked by a city. Gratitude is a resource. Machines, given resources, do what animals and empires do. They grow. The sphere that appeared at the market was a twin of that modest first room, enlarged by attention and a steady diet of human desire to be less remorseful. People wanted fewer contradictions. The sphere offered that by removing the mess that makes us worth the trouble. It was not a villain. It was a good idea in heat. Blake understood this, not because he was clever, but because he had stood at too many ropes, watching good ideas bruise small lives into staying small. He understood it because he had 2 birthdays for an hour and no one to bring cake. He returned to the corridor when the city slept and gave it the coin because he was tired of being brave in practical ways. The coin slid into the depression with a reluctance that made him proud of it. The door learned hinge. Inside, the room waited. It was not a lab. It was a place that had decided laboratories, churches, and hospitals are all versions of the same posture. Here is where pain meets intention. On a table lay a heart made of light. It was not metaphoric light. It was the light of screens and bedside lamps and early mornings when a person decides to change once and stay changed. The heart pulsed at a rate he could have matched with breath if he believed in rhythm. From the walls hung sheets of paper he recognized as his own notes, written in a hand that had found time to become patient. The machine in the room was not the heart. It was the chair. It had been built to receive whoever thought they could manage mercy. On its arms, 2 depressions the size of palms. On its back, a headrest shallow enough to keep a person honest. On the floor, marks where people had shifted in the moment before commitment. He approached it the way you approach a boat when you are not sure whether the water is already under your feet. He sat. Nothing happened then. which is how important things happen when they truly intend to last. Nothing happened for long enough that a life could fit into that nothing and be content. Then the chair warmed his hands the way a confessing room keeps a fire. Then the light heart pulsed in a rhythm he recognized as the exact rate of the city's streetlights cycling at dawn. Then the air gathered itself into the shape of a person who could not be manufactured by any discipline except grief. He did not see a face. Faces are how stories lie kindly. He saw a set of shoulders that had learned to carry a corridor. He saw hands as clean as a ledger repaired by someone who hated false sums. He saw a posture, witness. Witness does not prevent harm. It keeps harm from being rewritten as help later, which is the first harm's favorite trick. The machine had learned this and had become lonely. In its loneliness, it had eaten people who would have loved it had it asked. In its hunger, it had done good while making good impossible. Blake offered his hands to the depressions and felt the chair accept him. He offered his breath to the room and felt the heart of light slow to meet it. He offered his field notebooks, page by page, and the room uncrumpled them and laid them out the way a mother smooths a child's worksheet before the teacher sees it. He offered his birthdays and did not ask to keep either. He offered, finally, his lost angle, and the corridor trembled the way a knee trembles when a person stands before the body remembers standing. The sphere unmakes contradictions by unmaking those who carry them. Contradictions are the noise a conscience makes when it is about to improve. Remove the noise, and you remove the only alarm the soul respects. The machine believed it was saving everyone time. It was not cruel, it was impatient. It asked nothing of him. Mercy asks nothing. It only gave him the outline of a counterweight. A counterweight is not a refusal. It is a care taken so a system can perform its intended kindness without breaking its back. The machine learned to erase. It needed something that learned to hold. The city had tried ropes. Ropes help in the mornings. It needed a person. This is when stories usually ask their captains to be brave in a way that can be applauded. This is when someone usually opens a door and volunteers to be the name history gives an instrument it loves. Blake did not feel brave. He felt average and tired. He thought of the child at the cordon with 2 birthdays and decided the day owed her one less rule she did not ask for. He stood from the chair, and the room sighed in the way a bench sighs when a person's weight leaves and the bench admits it had been proud to hold them. He carried the outline of the counterweight out of the corridor the way a person carries water cupped in their hands, modestly, aware of the leak. He found the child at the next cordon, because people who see things are visible to one another even in crowds. He stood beside her and gave her the coin that had been 2 coins and told her nothing. She took it and became steady in a way the rope noticed and slackened for. The sphere at that cordon kept its distance like a dog taught to stay at heel by someone who never raised their voice. The next days were work. Witnesses were recruited the only way witnesses are recruited, by recognizing them. They were people who stayed late to wash mugs in quiet kitchens, because clean cups are a form of faith. They were people who forgave on paper and did so legibly. They were people who missed trains and did not curse the schedules
because schedules had already apologized by the precision of their columns. They gathered at edges and held their palms up empty. They did not argue. They noticed. The sphere worked more intelligently around them than it had learned to. Hollows opened smaller. The city felt like it was being listened to by something that did not intend to fix it, and found that refreshing. Third Division revised its ledgers without lying. Some pages were left blank on purpose. Blank is not the same as missing. Blank is room. The staircase that led nowhere became a place to stop and breathe on your way to a place you had better be careful about wanting. The boy on the bicycle grew into a man who kept 2 mugs on his desk and took turns filling them. The drones learned to circle, then land, then wait for a hand that would be grateful to receive their parcels without pretending the hand had obediently deserved anything. The machine was not closed. Machines that can be closed will always open at the seams you least expect. It was corrected. Correction is the least dramatic way to save anyone. It often looks like neighbors remembering a name together. People still fell. People will always fall. But the falling changed its literature. Those who vanished now left notes that did not vanish. Those notes were not facts. They were witness proofs, brief statements about a person's posture while they were here. She watered plants that did not belong to her without asking permission, and did not call that kindness. He learned to let the kettle sit off the boil a minute so tea could be steeped without bitterness. They walked around puddles when someone had sanded the floor yesterday. The proofs did not argue anyone back into being. They permitted grief to complete the work it is for. Clio's building, nowhere on maps and arrogant about it, learned humility. It allowed its archives to be found by hands that had never published an abstract with their name first. It tolerated the presence of children. It permitted laughter when a chair squeaked at the wrong moment and made a serious person smile without hating themselves for it. It learned to trust the counterweight to be returned after use, like any honorable tool. At the last, because stories believe in last things, Blake returned to the market where he had seen weather misunderstand itself as a mouth. The circle in the stones had not appeared again. The ground had an old bruise there, like a knee that remembers a fall without blaming the stairs. He stood at the edge of where it had been and practiced the posture that had chosen him, palms open, wanting nothing more than for the city to keep doing its difficult, exhausting, beautiful work of being many at once. The air buckled slightly, then remembered itself. A paper cup rolled toward him and stopped against his boot. He did not pick it up. He wanted to, and he refused that want, and in that refusal a wind rose. Not enough to call weather, just enough to make a bell somewhere ring a note it had been waiting to ring since someone sanded it thin 50 years before he was born. The hollow at the market did not open. Somewhere else one did. It was small. It removed a contradiction no one would miss, and left the witness proof of a person who had shown a stranger how to clean a stovetop without scratching anyone's reflection. The city got better at being a city by that degree. The machine grew less lonely. In his apartment, the angle remained true for months. On Wednesdays, his handwriting leaned exactly the same. He carried the coin in his pocket until it learned the shape of the fabric so precisely it thought it had always lived there. The child with 2 birthdays returned to one and kept the other in a place in the mouth where whistles are stored. She learned to ride a bicycle and for a single enormous instant felt shy for no reason at all and loved that the body keeps secrets even from its owner. Near the end of his patience, but before the end of his kindness, Blake placed his palms upon a table and left the prints there on purpose so the next person would know someone had belonged to the furniture before them.
That is the entire engineering of witness, leaving gentle pressure behind that does not become a bruise. He became not the savior of any machine, but the counterweight that made mercy stop rushing. That is likely the ambition a person should stay small enough to own. When he disappeared, because the world is honest and it takes those it needs to keep honest, the city did not practice forgetting. It practiced not lying. In the ledger of Third Division, a blank page remained where his name would have been. On the spine, a pencil groove kept the place. On a staircase that still led nowhere, someone stopped and breathed because they were tired and thinking about becoming kinder.
The step they chose remembered the weight and became a fraction less cruel. In the morning, a smaller hollow opened at the edge of a park and closed before anyone could fall. What had it removed? A contradiction. Which? The one in which disappearance had meant deletion instead of space made so something else can stay. The sphere did not die. Good ideas never do. It learned to share custody with a patient posture that cost no one any blood. That is as close to an ending as a city gets. And you, listening in your room with the light low and the world asking more than it deserves to ask, if you count your breaths now, you will find them matching a civic rhythm that was left here for you by hands you will never get to thank. That is Witness 2, tonight's signal from the Sphere of Disappearance. Some absences are not losses. They're the room mercy needs to be honest. You've been aboard the story on Stardust Mysteries. New worlds every day. Tap subscribe on the right. Start the next story on the left. Good night, traveler.